So welcome. My name is David Mirhady. Welcome on behalf of my family. We're kind of scattered about, but my mother is here, Dr. Katharine Mirhady. And just a reminder to turn off your cell phones. And the way it's going to go is that I'll introduce our Vice President of the University, Dr. Peter Keller, and then he will pass the microphone on to my colleague, Azadeh Yamini Hamadani, who will introduce our speaker, and then finally we'll hear from Dr. Mirsepassi. And I must say, this is the first time we've had a speaker whose name starts with Mir. And I think of all the Mirs as cousins, in a way. So it's very nice for me to be able to welcome Dr. Mirsepassi.
Thank you, David, and good evening, everybody. Let me start by acknowledging that we are gathering this evening on the unceded Coast Salish territories, the traditional territories of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Coquitlam First Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Katharine Mirhady, members of the Mirhady family, I see some here, I'm sure there's some somewhere else. It's my really great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Simon Fraser University to the 15th annual Doctors Fereidoun and Katharine Mirhady Endowed Lecture in Iranian Studies. Our distinguished visiting recipient of the Mirhady Endowed Lectureship this evening is Dr. Ali Mirsepassi, Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Sociology at New York University. Welcome out here on the West Coast. His distinguished lecture this evening is the latest in over a decade of important talks enabled by the Mirhady Endowment. And these very diverse and exciting lectures have ranged in time across many, many different subjects, from ancient Iran to the contemporary period, covering issues of epic and modern poetry, revolutions, gendered surgery, film, cosmopolitanism, political and literal nonconformity, Persian self-understanding, transnationality, and urban identities, amongst many other topics, and another really exciting topic to be added tonight. I'm sure you join me in a deep appreciation of Drs. Katharine Mirhady and the late Dr. Fereidoun Mirhady for their generosity in creating the endowment that has made these lectures possible. Their generosity, and indeed the generosity of that of many others in the Iranian community, have laid the foundation to promote and advance academic programming in Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University. Persian languages courses have been offered over the last 7 years. Our library continues to receive gifts of important Farsi language lithographies and manuscripts, and we are teaching courses on Iranian history and Persian literature. Over the next few years, we hope to augment these exciting courses further to advance Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University, founded on academic excellence and an engagement with a vibrant Iranian community here in British Columbia. And of course, I invite all of you to participate in this vision of Iranian studies at Simon Fraser University. Now, enough of me. It is my real pleasure to introduce Professor Azadeh Yamini Hamadani from SFU's World Literature Program, and really one of the key visionaries of an Iranian Studies program at the university. I'll hand the microphone over to you.
خوش آمدین. Welcome to the 16th annual Mirhady Lecture in Iranian Studies. We're delighted that you could be here this evening to join us in welcoming our esteemed guest, Dr. Ali Mirsepassi, who's a professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Sociology at the Gallatin School in New York University. He's the author of many fascinating books And if you haven't read them already, I would urge you to order them right away. So there's your homework. His books, just to give you a few titles, are on democracy in modern Iran, transnationalism in Iranian political thought, intellectual discourse and the politics of modernization, and political Islam, Iran, and the Enlightenment. And that's just a few. Dr. Mirsepassi has received several prestigious awards for his groundbreaking research and his teaching. His talk this evening will explore the ways in which Iran emerged as a modern nation in the 1930s and the ways in which it reconciled modern secular ideologies with its rich mystical tradition. So without much ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Mirsepassi.
Thank you. Let me thank Mirhady family for their support of this wonderful lecture series. I was telling one of the colleagues that every year I saw my friends and colleagues coming and giving this talk, and I felt totally left out until I was called. I'm delighted and pleased to be here. Let me also thank Vice President Keller, Professor Kuhn, certainly Professor Yamini Hamedani for very nice introduction, and everyone for helping and making this event possible. Thank you, Department of History and the university for inviting me, and very special thanks to all of you who are taking time and coming and being here. My lecture is based on, at least partly based on my new book and partly on the book that was mentioned earlier that I published last April, Transnationalism in Iranian Political Thought. So that I can speak within the limited time I have, I decided to do a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not very good at it, and I hope I don't just disregard it and talk to you. I will try not to. My talk tonight conceptually is influenced by works of two scholars that I am generally very much influenced by, particularly Muhammad Arkhond, the Algerian French philosopher and scholar of Islam that I'm sure that some of you know about, but unfortunately we don't have time for me to present a detailed view of his ideas. And Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, they both share and have written about the notion of social imaginary. And I want to take a couple of moments and explain this, and then start specifically speaking about Iran. What is interesting about Arkhond's view on social imaginary is the following. By the way, in the parentheses, to avoid speaking for a long time, I am not going to read everything that you see on the PowerPoint. I will just try to summarize and also provide some context into what my discussion are, but I am just hoping that you can read what is on these slides. Arkhon makes two important points that are relevant to my discussion today. One is that Arkhon makes the argument that nation makings involves two different but interrelated processes. One is a material and institutional processes of creation of central states, bureaucracy, so on and so forth, economy. But from Arkhon's point of perspective, nation making is also a creative idea. Nation making is also about giving meanings to our life and our society and our understanding of ourselves and our nation. And his argument is that, of course, these are very connected and ongoing and continuously redefining notions. Because if we agree that nation making is a creative process, it's always in the process of remaking and reimagining and reconfiguring. He also makes the argument that, of course, when we write about nations, we use reason and rational thinking. We produce history of nations in rational and in history. Not the creative story of the nations are usually privileged, but a more analytical, historical perspective on the nations. He also argues that, but who tells the creative story of nations? And he makes the argument that the creative or imaginative story of the nations are the privileges of the poets and the artists and the prophets. Again, there is no time to go into details, but his broader argument is that, therefore, in the study of any nations, we need to look at cultures, literary, artistic, and religious cultures of a society because they are absolutely instrumental in making of the nation. He also makes the argument that this creative quality of making a nation gives a transcendental, almost permanent meanings to nations, and we have to be aware of this. His second point that is also relevant to Charles Taylor's point is that because nation-making is an imaginative or creative process, to a large extent, not exclusively, but to a large extent, it is also a space for ideological, cultural battle and struggle. And therefore, we cannot be indifferent to it. His larger argument, is that culture matters and imagination matters because it basically also offers meaning to our everyday life. I come back to this at the end of my talk. Charles Taylor's argument, which I don't have time to go into, but there are 2 points that are relevant to this discussion. One is that social imagination is a window through which people make meaning of their life or their understanding of their own life and their society. And therefore, it's very important. People's behaviors are motivated by their notion of social imaginary, how they see themselves and their nations. That is, of course, very important. And his second point, it's not here. And his second point is that, again, that social imaginary is the space for defining self and the nation. So I am using this notion of social imaginary to try to explain tonight two very distinct intellectual debates that took place in Iran in 20th century. 20th century, for anyone who is interested about nation making and nation building in Iran, is extremely important. Why is that important? Because we had two major revolutions. In 1906, we had the Constitutional Revolution, early 20th century, and in late 20th century, we had the Islamic Revolution or the Iranian Revolution of 79. Of course, we don't have time to go through the history of 20th century Iran. What I have decided to do is to just very specifically look at two intellectual debates where, according to Erfan, those who have the privilege of imagining creatively how a nation is, in this case intellectuals, are engaged in defining social imaginary of modern Iranian nation. These two debates, one take place in post-Mashruteh period in 1930s, and the second one takes place in 1981, 2-3 years after the revolution. Generally speaking, both of these two debates more or less center around the issue of modern rational thought, if you want to call it that, or secular knowledge, and religious or mystical Erfan traditions in Iran. I will get into some of the details a little later on, but for sake of just being brief, one can argue that both of these debates, although they are about 50 years apart, are about the same conceptual, cultural issues. Relationship between, if you want to even be broader, religious traditions and modern scientific traditions. I want to, however, make one point which I cannot go into details because I need to explain these two debates, that these debates are not about Iranian past and future or present. These debates are not about whether Iran should be a religious nation of the past, pre-modern or modern. Both groups that are involved in these traditions are thinking of trying to shape and configure and create a modern Iran, but with different views of how modern Iran should look like. I would be happy to talk a little more about this in question and answer time, but I need to say that, contrary to what some folks may argue, this is not about whether Iran should be modern or not. Almost everybody who is involved in these debates in one way or another is thinking of Iran as a modern category. It may look strange, but the first post-Mashruteh debate that takes place in Iran from 1933 to 38, during Reza Shah Pahlavi's rule, immediately after Mashruteh, centers around ideas of a French philosopher, Henry Bergson. When I was writing my book, I was puzzled for 6 months, and I did not know why is it that these four, although there are others, but I'm focusing on 4 intellectuals, very eminent intellectuals of Iran from various political and cultural perspectives, are so much focused on either critiquing or defending or explaining Henry Bergson. Why is it that in 1930s, Henry Bergson becomes such a big deal in Iran? Just briefly, the four who are involved in these debates are Taghi Arani, Ghulam Reza Rashid Yasemi, Ahmad Fardid, and Muhammad Ali Furughi. I will explain them in a moment. The first substantial piece of writings about Henry Bergson that I am aware of was written by Taghi Arani. Taghi Arani is probably the first or the founder of Marxism as an intellectual enterprise in Iran. He was born in Tabriz, goes to Berlin, studies in Berlin for less than a decade. He was a fervent nationalist and then becomes friends with Marxists in Germany. And obviously, he studied actually chemistry, got a PhD in chemistry, but he also worked with German Orientalists and edited a volume on Sadi and a volume on Khayyam with Professor Rosen, the famous Orientalist in Germany, comes to Iran, publishes the most important Marxist or radical monthly in Iran, Dunya. And what is amazing is that in the first 6 issues of Dunya, which is really half of the Dunya was only published for 2 years. In 6 out of the 12 issues of Dunya, Arani writes about Bergson and Persian Erfan or Sufism. Obviously, we don't have time to go into this, but I want to make this point that this is not just a reference to Bergson. It's a substantial amount of work at this time by Arani. So Arani's argument is basically he is extremely alarmed by popularity of Arani's ideas in Iran, or even possibility of Iranian readers becoming interested in Bergson. By the way, Bergson, who is at this time perhaps the most important European philosopher, a Nobel laureate, and an extremely powerful intellectual in Europe, and Iran is going through modernization process and looking at what is happening in Europe. That is, of course, at least partly accounts for why Bergson becomes important. Arani's argument, very briefly, is that, one, Bergson's ideas is the old wine in a new bottle. There is nothing new about what Bergson is trying to say. That Christian existentialism is not that much different than Sufism in the West or East. And at the end of the day, what Bergson is trying to do is to deny the primacy of scientific thought, agency of human being in social change and making their own society, and primacy of a spirit. Arani's writing is very actually harsh and radical, and there is no time to go into this, but you read these, the whole 6 articles are about 80 pages. You realize that Arani is annoyed and extremely alarmed by a French gentleman and a world-renowned philosopher basically arguing ideas that from Arani's perspective are very close to ideas of the Sufi traditions. Again, in parentheses, I have to say that Arani was very much aware of the value of Iranian literature and poetry, including Sufi literature, including Erfan as a philosophy. And that's not the discussion. the discussion that the issues that Iranis are discussing in this piece is the political role of Erfan in Iran, which we know and is a recurring theme in Iranian history. And each time that Erfan enters in political realm, it becomes very violent and brutal and destructive. But that's another issue for later. The second person who is involved in this debate is a very surprising one. Rashid Yassami, again, a very eminent modernist, blatantly secularist intellectual. Rashid Yassami translated some of the important classic literary texts, European texts, to Iran, was certainly famous perhaps as the leading secularist intellectual in Iran, but he was also close to the royal court. In fact, at the time that he wrote this piece, he was the director of the cultural affairs of the court. Now, what is important about his talk about Bergson is that, so this is during Reza Shah period. And there is an ongoing tension between the state and religious institutions in Iran. And the state is suppressing and limiting religious expressions and so on and so forth. The only exception during this time is the faculty of theology. Madraseh Manqul Manqul. The state sort of cautiously let the faculty of theology function, and the theology faculty and students are also doing their own affairs, trying to ignore what is going on in the larger society. But there are lots of tensions, and some of the tensions actually, there is a history about this. But at some point when the leadership of the theology school decides to make a friendly gesture toward the court, toward Reza Shah. And they invite Rashid Yassami to give a public talk to the faculty and students of theology department. This was so important when I went and looked at the newspapers and magazines, weekly magazines during this time. The whole event became a national event, although I really mean became a national event within the boundary of Tehran. Every newspaper and magazines are talking about the fact that Rashid Yassami was invited to give a talk at the center of religious thought that was functioning at the time. This was huge. What is amazing to me is Rashid Yassami decides to give a talk about Henry Bergson at the Faculty of Theology, which is very interesting. He doesn't talk about anything else except for Henry Bergson. Now, again, there is no time to go into details, but Rashid Yassami, being a blatant modernist, just decides to do something that I would say is purely ideological. Doesn't really talk about who Henry Bergson is or is not. He goes and he addresses the audience and the faculty and the students of theology school, and basically said that, look, the world is changing. Iran is also changing. If you care about Islam, if you care about Iranian tradition, if you care about future of what you believe in, let me give you an example. Here is the most important European philosopher, Henry Bergson, who is religious, who is person of faith, but who is challenging the European theological orthodoxy. He has shaken the foundation of Orthodox religious institutions in Europe, and people, hundreds and hundreds of people are following him, and he meaning Bergson, is arguing is that it is time to believe in change. It is time to update our traditions, and it is time it's hard to say. I want to be nice to Rashid Yassami. Basically, Rashid Yassami also makes up some argument on behalf of Rashid Yassami and says, well, the same way as His Majesty Reza Shah, Bergson is also saying work and work hard and make your nation a better nation. Bergson doesn't talk about those issues, but you can sort of relate it to this. And basically says that, look, Bergson and His Majesty are saying the same thing. Don't do this for me or for the state, but do it for Islam and for your own faith. And then the last person who is involved in debate is even more prominent than the other three. Muhammad Ali Foroughi. Foroughi was twice Prime Minister of Iran. Once under Reza Shah, and then the first Prime Minister of Iran under his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. Foroughi's classic philosophy text, Seyr Hikmat dar Urupa, Development or History of Philosophy in Europe, was the classic philosophy text that we all read for about 50 years. Although some people may argue that still is the most important text on European philosophy. What is interesting is that the History of European Philosophy book is a 3-volume book. In these 3 volumes, the volume 2 is the longest chapter in the entire book about Bergson. We don't have time to go into this, and I discussed this in my last book, but it is amazing that, and the history of European philosophy starts from the Greeks up to early 20th century, but Foroughi gives more space to discussion of Bergson than anyone else. And this is very interesting. Foroughi's argument, but you read, and this is also about 70, 80 pages. I have read it hundreds of times. Obviously, I'm exaggerating. I've read it many times. You read this text, you see the pain that Foroughi is going through in writing this chapter. Foroughi is not Rashid Yassami. Although Foroughi was very close to Reza Shah, well, as I said, he was the prime minister of the Reza Shah, not at the time necessarily. But he was a very fair person. He was a man with a sense of self-integrity. He couldn't just make up things. He couldn't say that Bergson has said things that Bergson has not said. So he has to present Bergson's ideas. But so every page or every other page, then he realizes, well, this is very, very close to the notion of muraqabeh and shuhud and other notions that we have in Persian Erfan, and then he writes editorial notes. Dear readers, you have to understand that although these ideas, say Bergson's notion of intuition, for instance, the distinction that he makes between intuition and intelligence. He goes on and on to say that just keep in mind that Bergson is a European gentleman. He's a very serious scholar. He has done lots of hard work. He doesn't say that our own RFs or scholars are not really serious people and they just say mumbo jumbo, but he more or less within the confine of his very elegant writing, he basically says that I am begging you, don't identify Henry Bergson's ideas with that of Erfan. He does that. And the second thing he does is that he basically, when he gets into really detailed discussion of Bergson's ideas, particularly the idea of intuition and intelligence, he basically says that, yes, it is true that Bergsons argue that there is a higher form of knowledge than the analytical scientific knowledge that he called intuition. But at the end of the day, for Bergson, and then he makes the argument is that, of course, as such an intelligent person, I'm sure that he's thinking that both intuition and intelligence are part of the same modern thinking. And basically, he more or less says that as much as you can try to distance from the idea of shuhud and self-knowledge, hikmat unsi, those important philosophical concepts that come from pre-modern Iranian traditions, and look at what Bergson is trying to say. So these three are modernist intellectuals. They are, again, Arani was a Marxist intellectual. Rashid Yasami was a modernist and very secular scholar. Foroughi was a secular and modernist person, but was also a religious person. But all three of them, despite of their ideological and political differences, are focusing on the fact that there is a danger growing in Iran of those who want a mix of mystical or Persian Erfan with politics. And they are very aware of this. And they do it in different forms because these are different people. But in a very effective way, they offer a rather serious critique of a kind of thinking that is anti-scientific, anti-rational, and questions the validity of human agency. The only person among these four who have this discussion is a young 28-years-old person from Yazd, who was really nobody very important at this time, although later became very important. His name is Ahmad Fardid. I have to say that Ahmad Fardid writes in 2 articles in Mehr, a very prominent monthly at the time. He writes 2 articles about Bergson. It's called Bergson and Bergsonian Philosophy. And he basically takes the total opposite point of view. Unfortunately, there is no time for me to go into details. But his argument is that, look, Iranians, yes, we do all want to make Iran a contemporary, a strong, valuable, good society. But why should we follow the Westerners? When the most important philosopher in Europe, Henry Bergson, is more or less repeating what we already know. And then goes on one and one. Particularly, he gets Bergson's notion of intuition and intelligence, and said that in Islamic, or particularly in Persian Erfan, we have notions of ilm-husuli and ilm-huzuli. The knowledge of the self, the knowledge that comes from batin, from the self, and the knowledge of other things from outside. And all of our valuable and important philosophers and scholars in history of Iran, even before Islam, because at the time he was also influenced by pre-Islamic traditions, have taught us this already. And he basically embraces Bergson for challenging the orthodoxy, modernist orthodoxy. Now, we all know what happened. This piece was written in 1938. Reza Shah had to leave Iran in 2 years. In the 40s, Iran, an Iranian nation, an Iranian culture, and Iranian politics became even more modernist and more secular. In other words, this intellectual battle took place for social imagination of Iranians and also how to imagine Iran as a modern nation. The first three were successful, although I'm really using this intellectual debate as symbolic. It's not that this was not the only thing that was happening. But it embodies the fact that people were taking the tradition of Mashruteh seriously. From my perspective, although this happened during the Reza Shah rule, what this means is that Iranians were intimately aware of the fact that the value of Mashruteh, the constitutionalism in Iran, which, by the way, as we know, religious and secular forces were involved in creating and making it, and defended it. And some people like Fereidoun and others lost. They became marginalized. Fereidoun became even more marginalized in the 40s than was in the 30s. So in some respect, you can say, to go back to Archon and Taylor, the battle took place. The modernists, I am a little generalizing, won the battle. Then then the situation in Iran changed. The argument that I make in my new book that is not out yet is that beginning in 60s, certainly in 70s, both the oppositional intellectuals and others, political activists, but also the Pahlavi estate, retreated from the Mashruteh tradition. I have 2 books that are about to be published. My second book actually focuses on the in the 60s and 70s and Pahlavi estate and how they try to appropriate this whole notion of Garbzadegi. They are based, so in some respect, both the official ideology of the state changes from a sort of modernist, secular, at least semi-Mashruteh kind of discourse to nativism. And of course, the Islamists and even radical secular intellectuals also retreat from the Mashruteh tradition, and there are good reasons for this. I'm not trying to say we cannot explain this. And this nativism becomes dominant. Now, in the book, I go through Iranian cinema, I go through many journals. I have a chapter on the last book that Shah wrote himself just 6 months before revolution, and explain this huge radical change in social imaginary of the Iranian elite. But for this talk, I have decided to focus on an intellectual debate similar to the 30s. This particular debate took place in 1991. Now, my goal is, this is not about necessarily post-revolutionary Iran, because these folks had these ideas before the revolution, and what I'm trying to say is that the actual change took place in late 60s and certainly in the 70s. The new book that I have that discusses this is called The Quiet Revolution. My argument is that there was a quiet revolution first in social imaginary of Iranians, and then there was the political revolution. Can somebody tell me how much time I have? Or do I have about 10 minutes? Or something? Okay. Well, I have different versions of this talk. Stop me when I go over my time. So this is after the revolution. The Islamic Republic comes very aggressive, and in fact, the Islamic Republic is very much aware of how social imagery shape a nation. And they set up a series of what they call, this is not my words, ideological debates. And they invite all political forces and intellectual figures to participate. There is no time for me to discuss this. Some participate, some don't participate in these debates. They become national phenomenon early after revolution. It captures everybody's imagination, these debates. Because we don't have time, I just want to focus on one of these debates and tell the story of what happened. So this is a TV image of one of these debates. This is the moderator. This is Abdul Karim Surush, who was sort of an important intellectual at the time, but later became probably the most important religious intellectual. This is Mirsepassi Yazdi, the most conservative Ayatollah in Iran then and now. And these two this is Ehsan Tabari, the older man, probably the most important Marxist intellectual of Iran, member of the Central Committee of the Party, and somebody who wrote some very, very important text about philosophy, Iranian history, Marxism, so on and so forth. And the younger person is Farrokh Nigahdar, who was the leader of the most important Marxist organization after the revolution, the Fereidoun guerrilla organization. So the name of this debate, the debates are presented to Iranian public as ideological debate. Before this, the moderator basically says that we have made a revolution. People want to say that this is a revolution for economic reasons or for political reasons. This is an ideological revolution. We won the battle of ideas, and now we want to have debates about them. So after the moderator says this, Mirsepassi Yazdi follows that. And basically, before that, both Ehsan Tabari and Farrokh Nigahdar makes point that this is unnecessary. There is a sort of little side debate going on between the moderator and those two who said, well, we are all revolutionaries, we all support the Islamic Republic. Why do we want to divide the nation? Why do we want to talk about ideologies? Let's talk about the war is going on. The war with Iraq just started. I think this is like a couple of months after the war, or a year after the war. So in response to that, Mirsepassi Yazdi makes this argument and says, no. The war, violence, bloodshed, all the sufferings that we are doing it for our faith. We are doing it for our own ideology. There is a more important and meaningful thing going on, and that is what we believe in. And that is why it matters. It does matter. Economy doesn't matter. And politics doesn't matter. And basically, this is a long, actually, debate that's going on. Makes the point that, no, ideology do matter. And in this context, it says, well, you guys are materialists. We are religious. And we need to debate this and discuss this. And he constantly also says that the respected Iranian audience or whoever watched the TV should know this. This is very important to Iranian people. Tabari is in a very difficult situation. I have to say in parentheses, this is a post-revolutionary Iran. Islam is very important. Ayatollah Khomeini is very important. technically you can make the argument that these two intellectuals make a mistake going public, but also being unwilling to debate. So you can make that argument. It's a very difficult situation for these two. And the TV is state-run, and the moderator is totally in Mirsepassi Yazdid's side. But he makes this argument, and he says, well, that's not true. That Marx and Engels, it's true that there is this notion of contradictions in dialectic. This is a reference to both Soroush and Mirsepassi Yazdi, who said, well, I want you to defend your notion of dialectic and contradictions. And their understanding is that you are saying that world changes because of dialectic, and people believe in religion, and then there is progress, and then it becomes secularism. They are trying to say that that is not true, and revolution basically proved that the future is with faith, with religion. And Tabari tries to make his argument, no, you are misunderstanding Marxism. Instead of defending his own ideas, he tries I feel he probably feels that he's a smart way to say that, no, Marx and Engels' idea of history is monistic. In other words, is unity of subject and object. And basically, but he uses the term, he says, well, Marx and Engels' view of dialectic or the world is Tawhidi. Tawhidi is a very heavily religious term. One can say that maybe monism can be translated into Persian or into Arabic as Tawhidi, but certainly everybody knows that Tawhidi is a religious term. He uses that. Mirsepassi becomes extremely agitated by this and said, well, although it's very interesting that Mirsepassi always is talking to the Iranians, people who are watching the TV, and saying that don't be confused with what Tabari is trying to say. The reference to the fact that materialists may have different views of subject and object, and one believe in sort of materialist monotheism, has nothing to do with our idea of Tawhid. These people are materialists, and they do not believe in the faith. And they all share that view. And this is just a small part of what they debate. And he basically insists that you guys are atheists, you don't believe in faith, and you should better say that. What is interesting is that these two intellectuals, in contrast to what happened early on in the other debates, don't know what to do. Right? So Tabari again gets into a debate on the fact that, well, there is no tension between believing in Marxism and being person of faith or Islam. And then he goes on to say that, well, and even notion of dialectic, people like Mullah Sadra and Shirazi and others also believe in dialectic. What is interesting about this is that Tabari actually wrote a book in the 70s, before the revolution, and made these arguments. Some people laughed at him. Other people felt, well, he's being sneaky, trying to mobilize Muslims by making these kind of arguments. But I want to say that this is something that Tabari really believed in. It wasn't, he wasn't making this up. And he basically tried to say, well, instead of defending or explaining what his own idea is, that basically there is no difference between particularly those Islamic Iranian philosophers who are close to mysticism and Marxism. So again, as you say, that he basically then moves on to say that, look, revolution has happened. There are revolutionary Marxists and there are revolutionary Muslims, and there are those who oppose the revolution, and some of them are also Marxist or materialist, and some are religious, basically calls for unity, right? And then, but Mirsepassi doesn't let him go, and he basically makes these points and basically makes a very clear, articulated argument on what is the difference between materialists and religious folks or Muslims but he gives his own narrative. What is amazing is, I'm not representing the whole argument here, but this is about 2 hours, a little less than 2 hours. In all of these arguments, the two secular or Marxist intellectuals do not defend themselves, do not talk about, say, mixing of politics and religion. They do not even remotely make any critical comments about the other side, and they don't defend their own ideas. They just, Farrokh Negahdar, and I don't have any quote from him, keeps saying that let's all go to the front and fight Iraqis and imperialism. What is important is imperialism. And basically, from my perspective, so that I don't go too long, these two intellectuals totally give up ideologically or culturally speaking. And you read or you watch the entire debate, and there is no one remotely speaking argument that possibly somebody can make and say that we don't want ayatollahs to run the country, or that yes, there is some value in, say, scientific thinking, or it's not that everything materialist that is bad and there is no value in it for the society. So this is clear. Of course, then when he's challenged that, are you calling Mullah Sadr a Marxist? Then he has to say, in a very apologetic way, no, I'm not saying this, but they had some ideas that are close to ideas of Marx and Engels. Now, the conclusion of my talk. So, the larger, broader context, of course, is that the first debate was not just an intellectual debate. The first debate embodies what Iranians achieved during the Mashruteh and post-Mashruteh period. And that was achieved, I'm sure that all of you know this, the Mashruteh or the constitutional movement or revolution or period was a rather long period, and it involved a very serious cultural, ideological, if you want to call it that, or battle of ideas. In fact, for about 40 years before 1906, Iranian politicians, intellectuals, cultural figures, literary figures, they were all involved. Almost all the cultural elite of Iran were mobilized to articulate a new vision for modern Iran. I'm not saying that there was no problem. One can be critical of them. But it is true that it was an amazing and powerful movement that articulated what the image of modern Iran is. And they care about this, and they also realize that this is not something that only through a political or, say, socioeconomic changes can happen. It's a political battle, of course, but it's also a cultural battle. And for that reason, although Bergson wasn't in Iran, Bergson was not really doing anything to Iran, they were very, very cautious, very aware of this. And you can say that they won the battle. The debate in the 60s and 70s, although I really haven't talked about 60s and 70s. The ideological debate on TV that we saw is different. It's different. You have two leading members of the Iranian Marxist groups, the Tudeh Party and the Fereidoun, who either don't have anything to say, or maybe they have something to say, but they are not aware of the fact that the battle for creation of social imaginary is important. They are totally and exclusively focused on politics. And they feel that if they win the politics, culture doesn't matter, or broadly speaking. So one can say that in post-Mashruteh time and intellectuals, they were aware of the critical role of the social imaginary in making of modern Iran, whereas the secular intellectuals and Pahlavi estate, although I haven't really talked about that here, abandoned the Mashruteh project. That was clear. There is no discussion of, for instance, a very important modernist tradition in Iran is Mashruteh project. In fact, during the Mashruteh or constitutional revolution, 8 out of 12 important ayatollahs sided with the constitutionalists. They were at the lead in the leadership of the movement, and they could have made that argument. They either couldn't, or didn't know how to make that argument. But they gave up Mashruteh, and they also totally lacked a new vision for the social imaginary of Iran. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we have some time for questions. Yes.
What I want to ask, my hearing's not the best, maybe you mentioned it. There was you said reconciliation between Islam and Marxism. I'm not a Marxist, but the status of women under Marxism and under Islam, there's a vast difference. And the Marxists are atheists, they don't believe in religion. So, I can't see the reconciliation.
I probably agree with you. They didn't make that argument. The two Marxists were interested in making the argument that there isn't really any serious difference between Marxism and religion. They made that argument, but the issue of gender or woman was not discussed.
Thank you for the informative presentation. I enjoyed a lot. And there are 2 points here and 2 questions. First of all, I should disagree with the notion that in this debate, Tabari and Negahdar, the leftist leaders of the time, in this debate was televised, and millions are watching at the time when Islam is hot. So these two people, the first thing important for them was to compromise, not to really go head on in an argument with the Islamic regime. They wanted to have a stake in the regime. So in that debate, they did not want to involve themselves. As you said, they gave up, or they didn't have anything to say. I think their strategy was, first of all, to compromise and not to show their ideological differences with the regime while the people are watching. So I think that I disagree with the notion that they didn't have anything to say. They didn't want to say anything in that televised debate. The other point is that you said there were 2 revolutions, the constitutional revolutions, Mashruteh, and then the Islamic revolution. And I think you missed something important in between. We had another revolution. We indeed had 3 revolutions in the 20th century. So that was the White Revolution. You may say that that was a reform. It was not a revolution. It was officially recognized worldwide as a revolution. It was titled as a revolution, and we had textbooks in the school for the white revolution. And that's something that the Iranians are the only nations who have only that color, white revolution. We had red revolution and green revolution, but white revolution was also important and could be effective. What do you think about that? Thank you.
Well, I disagree with you on your first point. First of all, as I said, Ehsan Tabari has several books that he wrote before the Islamic Revolution. You said Islam was hot. I think you have a point there. But when Islam was not hot, Tabari wrote 10, 12 years before revolution his very important book and made more or less the same argument. He basically made argument after argument that Rumi, more or less, can be considered at least quasi-Marxist. And he also gave up this whole what Irani had. For Irani, Marxism was not an ideology necessarily. Say, if you read the first 2 years of Dunya, lots of the articles are about science, are about the status of women, status of different scientific disciplines. The early Marxists in Iran saw Marxism as a cosmopolitan, modernist, secular set of ideas. You can disagree with that, but that was what Marxism was. That was what attracted them to Marxism. The argument that Tabari made, this is before revolution, this is not in this particular debate after revolution, was that no, in fact, it is some kind of mysticism that has primacy. And this was before revolution. The other issue is that, say, even forgetting about the debate, although it's not that they were forced to debate Soroush and Mesbah on TV. In fact, the National Front did not agree. They said, well, this is not fair. You choose the moderator, you choose the topic, and this is not a good time to have the debate. They decided to do the debate, and they were attacked. They were attacked very powerfully on all of their ideas, and they didn't defend themselves. Now, if you look at the publications of To the Party and Fereidoun at the time, I think it confirmed what I'm saying. They really had very little to say.
Because the country was Islamized and they didn't want to reveal what they truly believed in front of millions of people.
No, there were millions of Iranians who were supporters of these groups. They were writing for them. You know, it's not that Muslim Iranians, you know, like whatever millions they were, they would go and buy To the Party's publications. In fact, To the Party's publications, in some respect, were more pro-Islamist than some of the, say, Mujahideen and other religious groups. I really don't get your point about white revolution. Shah announced that there is a revolution. By that definition, any head of a state can announce revolutions.
There was a referendum on that revolution.
Whatever it was, a state cannot make a revolution against itself. But, you know.
Okay, thank you.
I was just curious as to what the direct impact after these televised debates were, just because I'm not too familiar with the context, but
yeah.
It sounds like a very intellectual academic circle debate, but just afterwards, what was the effect?
Yes, actually, I'm glad that you asked this question because you just remind me of a personal thing. At the time, I was very sympathetic to the Fereidoun groups. I was totally demoralized and depressed for weeks. And it wasn't just me. Because, and obviously I didn't have this kind of context, a scholarly context to this, but I just felt that we have nothing to say. Well, I have to say, before this, I thought that Tabari and Nigahdar are going to destroy these two folks. I was naive and simplistic. I just thought that, how could an Ayatollah, I didn't know who Soros was. I thought, it's really mesmerizing. Ayatollah, there is no way that he can make any arguments because Marxism is evolved, a progressive tradition in the world. There is so much these people can say, and I have to say that I was totally demoralized after this. And there were a series of them, by the way, that these two debates. By the way, if you watch them, in many cases, not Tabari actually holds himself. In many cases, Nigahdar actually shows that he is totally ignorant of some of the most important issues about Marxism. That is, so the end result was that it was devastating for the left in Iran, very much so.
Thank you. My question is, how much, can we put this in the historical context? Things happened before the Islam came to Iran, where, we look at the history, we see all Bergson, for example, the theory there, they build a nation based on the government, the buildings, the whole structure of the nation there. But after that, when Islam came, where all of these ideas and Erfan and other things came in. Just put it in that kind of context. And the other question that I have maybe relates to that is how Iran place is in the world body of different nations. Like, are we unique in this kind of thought process, or there are examples of that other places taking place?
Yeah, thank you. These are good questions, but they are really broad questions. We need by far more time to go into this. Your first question about Islam and Iran and pre-Islamic Iran, I just make two quick comments. One is that, well, actually, it's not true that Erfan and mysticism is a post-Islamic. A very important, or perhaps the most important scholar, another French guy, who was extremely influential in Iran in making the argument that in the 60s and 70s, was Henry Corbin. And Henry Corbin's idea is that what we have in Iran is not the Orthodox Islam, or Islam as we know it, is what he called Persian Islam or spiritual Islam, which really reflects pre-Islamic Iranian tradition. So that argument doesn't work, that it's because of Islam. Secondly, I think I commented on this, but I had to probably explain this a little more, is that Fardid had no use for traditional Islam. In the piece that Fardid wrote, two articles on Bergson, Fardid didn't like ulama, didn't like Sharia, didn't like Islamic law. Fardid was not a practicing Muslim. It's not that he made the argument he made because he was too religious. But Fardid and others were interested in some other ways of imagining Iran as a nation, as Shah was. This is very interesting, and I said a chapter of my forthcoming book looks at the last book that Shah wrote himself. This book was published 6 months after revolution. And basically Shah presents himself as a great Sufi. Right? He wasn't a Sufi, right? He was the man that we all know this. This is about politics of identity at a particular time, And what is important is that what we call usually traditional religious figures and institutions were not involved in this. It would be wrong to mix up the two, sorry.
Thank you very much. I have one question for you, and actually one comment later. I'd like to know from your informed view how you reconcile Shah's religious, progress. When I grew up in Iran, what I knew, Shah was a Swiss educated young man, and his father was not very religious. But later on, when I was going through high school, I used to read that Shah has, had a dream tonight about Hazrat Abbas, and then, so many times actually these things I've read in Kayhan and the other newspaper in Iran, Italat, and then also his trip to for Hajj and other things. I could never reconcile these. So this is an opportunity for me to be informed from someone like you. And I guess
but
then
I should say that hopefully my forthcoming book will explain this, because as I'm sure that you know, the answer cannot be a very simple answer. But I will try. So I have two arguments here. And I want to actually make the argument that this is not about religion. Religion in a way that, say, some of us may be religion or some of our relatives are religion. What happened in Iran, in the context of this discussion and this whole notion of imagining a nation, this is really a post-Qajar period. The first real modern state in Iran was created during this period, more or less in the 20s and 30s. My argument is that, although unfortunately we always identify this with Reza Shah, as if this is product of only Reza Shah, this is a post-Mashruteh project. You may be interested in this. If you are interested, if you go and read the parliament, Majlis discussions in 4th and 5th Majlis, this is where both pro-Reza Shah and anti-Reza Shah parliamentarians debate on whether we should get rid of Qajar dynasty or not, should Reza Shah come and what his role should be. It's an amazing, rich kind of discussion of very eminent political figures and intellectuals in Majlis, and all of them participated in the actual constitutional revolution, because this is just a few years after that. Both sides made arguments on what is good for Iran. What would make Iran a progressive, cosmopolitan, even democratic Iran? It's really fascinating. I wish I had time to get into that. And both sides were defenders of Mashruteh. Now, those who were pro-Reza Shah would say, well, for some period of time, maybe democracy should not have primacy. But they never made the argument that democracy is bad. It was part of their argument. So we had, and this is what we have. Before this, Iran was different. I don't want to make a value judgment on this, but this is what we had. The Mashruteh period was the dominant way that we imagine Iran as a nation, despite all the disagreements, from Marxists to conservatives, including people like Bazargan and religious folks. After 1953, right? And after the nature of a state changed. Right? The Shah's regime was faced with a, I would argue, existential choice. And the choice was to continue and expand the Mashruteh tradition. And other places have done this. The middle class is growing. Iran, because of the oil and other reasons, and maybe because of the White Revolution, is being more urbanized, and also more, the society is becoming more complicated. People want to participate. Some of us were, I was at the Tehran University Law School, was very much frustrated that, we are now educated, I can't go to the library by myself. The decision was made at the state level that it's too dangerous to continue the Mashruteh project. Shah himself actually was very much influenced by Henry Corbin. Farah certainly was, very much so. Sayyid Hossein Nasr, who became the chief of staff of Farah, is an anti-modernist. We all know this. On the one hand. And then the oppositional group basically felt that the 1952 coup was the end of Mashruteh. My argument is that that is a wrong argument to make or conclusion to make, but this was what it was. We have Al Ahmad and Shariati and others who all, before this period, were constitutionalists, were modernists, were nationalists. In case of Al Ahmad, was a Marxist. They all felt that the Mashruteh project failed, and some kind of nativism is the answer. What is ironic and amazing is that more or less at the same time, although this happened at the state level a little later, both the opposition and the state came to the same conclusion at the same time. Then there was that battle, and of course, Shah lost. Because if the battle is the battle on nativism and Islamism, we know who will win, who has more connections with that kind of social imaginary to the Iranians.
Thank you very much. Can I make a comment? The gentleman alluded to the White Revolution. During Kennedy's years, if you Google, you will find out that the Soviet Union was making progress everywhere. Latin America, Europe, the Middle East. And there's an American idea that if you're a landowner, you will not give up that land for anything. You would defend it to death. Whereas if you're a peasant, you're susceptible to these Marxist ideas. So if you Google it, you will see that this revolution, or similar to that, is called land reform, has happened in Bolivia, in Chile, Iran, Colombia, all countries that were feudalist and they were susceptible to Marxist ideas. It happened. Shah was very clever. He codified it and he wrote a book and taught us in school. That's the difference.
Shah was clever to some extent, but in this book that I'm writing about the Iran during the Shah period, I use an example that I want to share with you. So the White Revolution happened in 1941, and 62, 41, 62, land reform and other things. Just a year after, in 1963, a popular film was made in Iran that became almost a national phenomenon. And this film later became a genre that both Shah and Farah publicized and funded and helped create. And that was, this particular film is about rural life. And how is it that people who live outside of the cities, particularly uneducated peasants who are simple but have integrity, have Iranian values, how they are mistreated by people of the cities. All of these genre of movies are extremely anti-Tehran, right? We don't have time to go into this, but I want you to, Majid Mohseni was the person who made this series of movies. Now, just a year after White Revolution, this particular film was shown for Shah. Shah was so affected and influenced by the movie that he wrote an executive order and basically asked the government not to tax this film and to try to see if this film can be shown all over the world, which actually was. When the film was screened in Farah Pahlavi's office, the report, this is in Kayhan, is that she could not stop crying. And in fact, later, Majid Mohseni was elected in the parliament. So what I'm trying to say is that in some respect, maybe Shah and those two Marxists had similar ideas. Shah felt that materially he can modernize Iran through land reform, white revolution. But culturally speaking, he was advocating something that, or he was criticizing something that he was creating. His policies were mainly responsible for urbanism in Iran. Why is it that there was this hatred of the middle class, particularly if they had some kind of education outside of Iran? This was the policy of the government to basically, with cheap dollar, send everybody there. All of these movies are against this. And by the way, Majid Mohseni, who never lived in any rural areas, was actually a very avant-garde artist who was involved in theater with Armenian Iranians in the art, and who lived in Europe most of his life, became advocates of these poor, innocent peasant people, and people who certainly were more sympathetic to someone like Khomeini than the Shah.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
پرستوها به لانه باز می‌گردند. However, this became a genre. So, yeah, I know that my father, who was pro-Shah and a very modernist sort of high official of the government, forced me to go and see this movie, and I hated it because, I couldn't identify with it. But my father just felt that this is what being an Iranian means, particularly because his son went to Paris and then wanted to marry someone in Paris. And he told me, if you go to, at the time I was, he thought that I would go to England, I said, no, I come back and I go to Dahad and marry somebody who, obviously my father didn't want me to marry, but would also ideologically advocate. This is the irony of the whole thing. Sorry.
One question. You mentioned that there was no...
Yes.
You mentioned that the constitution project was not implemented. Wasn't that the reason that we had an authoritarian regime? That when it was during the Reza Shah time and then Mohammad Reza Shah, so that authoritarian regime could not let people to get involved in the project for to complete the constitution. The second thing that I want to say is that you refer to that TV interview, dialogue. There was no dialogue. There never was dialogue between different group of people, different ideology in Iran. You mentioned that like Farrokh Negahdar or Mr. Tabari, they were so weak. Of course they were so weak. The old guy, 70 years old at that time, 2 years after, he ended up in the jail, tortured, and the young guy at that head of the organization, which I was a previous member of that organization, was only 27 years old at that time, and he was 5-6 years in the prison. So there was no dialogue, there was no free society. So it looks like you were expected that those guys to be more radical, insisting on their point. Yeah. They couldn't. Even at that time, the people on this side attacking the other side. You know better, you know. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Very briefly, since I'm sure that we have been here for too long. On the first question, of course, it is an issue. And as I said, the sort of existential question or challenge that Shah was faced with was to either open up the society, make Iran more democratic, and also rule Iran. This has happened in many, many other countries. Or to make Iran a police state and advocate some kind of anti-modern, anti-Westernism, and he chose the other. And because of that, you know, he has to abandon the Mashruteh project. Although this is, the issue is not as simple, it can be more complex. The second issue, I think I disagree with you. First of all, Ahmad Fardid, who, I hope I did say this, but probably wrote the most thoughtful defense of Henry Bergson at the time, was 28 years old, basically the same age than Farrokh Negahdar. Farrokh Negahdar, who studied in London, went to Iran, was a relative of Jazani, actually grew up in a very culturally rich environment, wasn't able to make an argument. And so you can't say Tabari was too old. You know, first Tabari was in his 60s, by the way, it wasn't 70s. And 60s is not that old. And you can say one was too young and one was too old. But I'm also telling you that Tabari, when he was younger, would say same thing or similar things. But I have to also say, since you mentioned there was no debate, what impressed me actually about this ideological debate is that Misbah Yazdi and Surush and the other two, 4 of them, treated each other personally in the most respected way, particularly Misbah Yazdi. With the kind of reverence that he treated Ehsan Tabari is amazing, because that is not who we know him to be. The other issue is, the issue that I'm trying to raise, I hope you are not concluding that I'm not saying that the entire history of 20th century Iran can be reduced to these 2 debates. These are symbolically important, but they also tell the larger story. However, they had a choice. I think that well, let me say this way so that I don't go on and talk forever. I do not believe that Tabari and Negahdar were aware of the fact that there is an ideological battle going on. Iran had become so political, similar to Shah. When Henry Corbin and Nasr and others advised Shah to try to basically reappropriate Islamism. He too felt that, well, ideas are ideas, anybody can just take them, there are no consequences. What I'm trying to say that there are consequences, and we saw this. That's all I have to say.